probably good to have a gap after Bill's talk, which was really interesting and made me think perhaps I should be doing a slightly different talk than I was planning. But I think perhaps I'll focus more on the sort of the end part of my talk. So I'll basically quickly run through what Grizedale is, a description of it, and some of the history behind it. So this is Grizedale. Come on. Yeah. This is Grizedale Forest, which is a Forestry Commission plantation, so a government-run plantation. Originally planted to replenish timber supplies after the war, so kind of a problematic from the get-go. This is Lawson Park Farm, which is our residency base, where we operate from, a small holding, and this is what the Lake District it looks like. So this is based in the middle of the Lake District, which is where Romanticism was born for Britain, and also the home of John Ruskin for 40 years of his life, quite interestingly. So he owned our farm at one point. So I'm going to talk a bit about Grizedale was set up in the forest plantation, kind of coming out of the artist placement scheme that John Latham ran, which was about placing artists in industry, placing artists in the real world. It was all very good in theory, artist placement scheme, but the reality of it was artists went and drew the real world or painted the real world. The projects in many cases weren't as interesting as the rhetoric.
When was that?
That was in the 70s, early 70s, mid 70s. And Grizedale started in 76 with David Nash, who was, is that a familiar name, people, David Nash? When he was very young, it was an opportunity for him to work alongside an industry. So not to make art, but to work alongside the forest industry. So it kind of started interestingly, and the ambition of the early artists was that they would go out with chainsaws and togged up like the foresters into the forest, and then the foresters started cutting down trees and the artists started making art. So suddenly the two things like veered wildly off in different directions. But anyway, David made some quite interesting work which kind of established him, but it also started a trajectory in Britain which ended with the Angel of the North. So the notion of public art, and interestingly, for me interesting, that started in a rural location rather than an urban one. It ended up very much in the urban, of course, public art, and that what we understand as public art now. And through this period, from mid 70s through till really until about when I arrived at the forest with the remit to reinvent. That is the kind of work that was made. David Nash set the blueprint, and Andy Goldsworthy and all the other people came and worked around those ideas. So they were all interested in American land art, and it was a kind of English, slightly, as most things English are, rather whimsical version, rather small scale, rather quaint. So when I arrived, what I should say is it wasn't intended as a visitor attraction. It was genuinely intended as a studio. And it very quickly became a visitor attraction, partly because it wasn't advertised. So people really enjoyed finding things. And that kind of looking and finding was a sort of strength for the program, but it didn't last long. Very quickly, people realised that it could be a tourist attraction. It was then promoted as such and became a series of trails. So by the time I arrived in '99 with this reinvent art in the rural, which was what I understood I was going to be doing, I think they thought I was going to reinvent a new tourist attraction, a new way for gathering more tourists. By that time it was trails, and the quality of the work was really dismal. The first time I saw it, I was just like, no way, I can't do this. This is horrific. But anyway, I did, and I set about the reinvention, which was largely not to make sculpture, largely to work with communities And what we did in the early years was generally rather confrontational. I had an idea about being honest about a rural context. I was brought up on a farm. I come from a rural context. I hate it in many ways and I love it in other ways. So it's the comfortable place that I exist in, and in the end I came back to. So I wanted to be kind of, I guess, tough about somewhere like the Lake District, which is this kind of problematic, beautiful landscape, which is increasingly just understood as a beautiful landscape, so with no other context at all. Whereas I've always understood the rural to be this very rich culture, which has been influential on how society evolves and develops. And the Lake District certainly has that evidence, and many other places too. So anyway, so what we started off with were these sort of projects by trendy, London-centric artists. Actually, nearly all of them came from rural places in reality. So this was Mark Titchener. When the mode of the music changes, the walls of the city shake is actually a Plato quote, interestingly. And this was a project called Roadshow, and this was a death metal battle of the bands held in the middle of the forest. And this project toured all around Britain to sort of periphery places and dealt with a lot of different traveller, sort of underclass culture through kind of mediation of artists and so on. This was another, so these were large-scale projects with lots of artists, an idea of collective working. There was no individual. They were Grizedale projects. And the artists, a lot of them found it difficult, particularly the more established ones. This is, all of these artists are now really well established. This was actually a William Pope L project at PS1, which is part of a project we did called Romantic Detachment, which was about how we romanticize each other's cultures in a way, and that interesting space in between all of that. And a bunch of young British artists being pelted with custard by the audience in one of William's typical "let's turn everything black, white." So they're playing Prince's Night, 1999. It's another project from the same thing, which was a live link-up between a comedy club and a pub in the Lake District, comedy club in New York. This is a Jeremy Deller. So these are all kind of funny, quirky, largely community-orientated, not really great pieces of work in many ways, but they were very popular. The art world loved them. It worked very well in the art world, which is kind of a disappointment for me. It took rural imagery and context and translated it. The artists tended to take it, have this fairly unique experience, and translate it into the art world to great success because they look a bit different. So this was a kind of dumb version of what we were thinking about. This Jeremy Deller piece, where he's this is in one of the village halls. This is a tea urn, which is a typical thing in Britain of the past, of course. Now they all have cappuccino machines, village halls. And Jeremy Deller had got somebody to do it up like hot rod car thing. And we got two of them made, and we used this one in the show in New York and so on as a functional thing. And then we sold the other one to the Tate. This was before Jeremy was that as major as he is now. And we got Jeremy to give this one to the village hall with the intention that the village hall would then sell it, and it would have this sort of simple translation of here's a bit of art, and then here's a new roof for the village hall. But actually they didn't sell it, they still have it, and what they've done with it is they rent it out to galleries all over the world, so they generate an income from it quite successfully. So in a way, not predicted. I mean, it's a little bit flat as an idea. And then this is a project, another village project. So these are all these projects, quite controversial, quite combative. This one is a reenactment of a 70s game called It's a Knockout, which was a very kind of stereotypical cartoon view of cultural differences. I mean, particularly fantastic, over the top, kind of basically racist commentary that ran through it. And in this instance, we reworked this with as part of a bigger village festival that we initiated. with the village, and this set Nash landowners against locals against tourists. So 3 teams that then fought out these sort of mad competitions, and these mascots you can see are the kind of local heroes of the past. So they won't be people you'll be familiar with. Actually, one of them will. One of them was Ruskin. But the other people that interesting that we're talking about sort of local identity. This one is Wright, who I'm sure nobody's heard of, who's a massive figure locally. And then the other one behind him is Donald Campbell, who is also regarded as the most important son of the Lake District. He so is not, but no one will have heard of him, and he's not interesting. Anyway, yeah. So that project was an interesting project because it was attempting to develop the community alongside the project. So it started a year before the program. There were endless meetings with the community in the process of development. It addressed a lot of issues about tourism and people doing things for themselves, and lots of kind of interesting material, which we kind of obviously still deal with because it's still there. And it's continued. So the whole festival is continued by the village, but they do it in their own way now. We occasionally take part once, not always, sometimes. The knockout thing happens every year, but the landowners refused to take part because they got so roughed up the first year. Although they won it, of course they won it. This is another project at LF Breinig. Slightly too complicated to go into. This is a typical kind of thing that artists were doing, reenacting, pointing at things and reenacting stuff. This was a very interesting group called the Kibo Kift from the 1920s, who were they were evolving the mythology of a national identity. So very much centred around Robin Hood, William Tell, and very much drawn out of the arts and crafts movement. And they were led, interestingly, by an artist. And these are the costumes he designed. So it was a kind of this extraordinary visual that their fundamental belief was spiritual enlightenment through camping, but which I guess is still going on out there, actually. But spiritual enlightenment through camping had an enormous following, 100,000 followers. And they used to create events in our local village. And so this was a reenactment of a march they'd done. And of course, we walked through the village with this reenactment, actually led by Ken Russell, who's kind of fairly well-known British filmmaker, a slightly controversial one. So sort of an extraordinary happening. And no one batted an eye because they just thought, oh yeah, whatever. This sort of thing happens all the time in the village. It's a tourist place. So there's the Rolls-Royce cavalcade of the Rolls-Royce Owners Club comes through the village, and millions of other kind of reenactment groups and all sorts of other things. So it doesn't mean anything. The fact that it had a direct relevance wasn't something that local people engaged with. So these projects, I'm kind of illustrating how they failed. I mean, they were quite fun, and this is a fascinating subject, and Quebec and Olivia Plender's toured this endlessly around biennales. So these projects are starting to get more, somebody watch the time, are starting to get more engaged. And this project was in Japan. It was called Seven Samurai. It was done for a kind of curious and slightly flawed rural program called Echgo Samari Triennale. And we were invited to do it, and we asked, so our premise was that we asked for a community to ask something of us, to set a problem that an artist group would solve. And we went with 7 artists. It was slightly like we were slightly having a laugh, the idea of the Seven Samurai, but of course actually the project followed the original film to the letter. So the idea was artists are a defunct sort of creed, and that they're going to try and help a village with a problem, but all the artists are too drunk and they're all too hopeless and all the rest of it. If you've seen the film, it'll resonate. And sure enough, most of the artists, no, not all, one of the artists actually was so drunk that I offered to take everybody and leave the village on one occasion. But actually, despite my embarrassment, it was actually broke the ice and built amazing effect of building trust in the villages. So the project anyway re-promoted their rice. We linked up with we were doing another festival in Tokyo, and which was more of a sort of performance thing, and we turned it into a farmer's market to promote the rice, and we basically, amazingly enough, transformed the morale really of the village. It was a place when we arrived that thought it was the last generation that would farm, there was no future, etc., etc. And in a very short space of time, 6 weeks, that had changed, and the village felt it did have a future. And what very interesting thing that happened at the end of it is I had a meeting with the head of the Triennale and the village leader, or the sort of annually changing leader in the village. There's only 60 houses in the village, so everybody gets to go to be the village leader once, at least. And the village leader very specifically explained to the Triennale they didn't want any more art in happening in their village. They only wanted to be involved in the kind of projects in which they were a participant and which were kind of about their issues. Which was very satisfying for me, I have to say. There's some more of that. So a little bit, another confrontational project, a billboard with a very aggressive text, which was burnt down by the village in an orchestrated artwork. So we took a piece of public art and we proposed to the village that they would do a project. They didn't like it, and nobody liked it. It was very attacked from all over Britain. The idea of placing a urban billboard in a very beautiful rural location, etc., all the usual things you might expect. So when we had this village project, which was to burn it down, it was quite interesting in terms of public art and who owns it and manages it. And this was a long time ago. This was in 2001. And we've actually, in many ways, continued with these kinds of ideas of transforming. In the case of the billboard, we made the billboard in the first place, but recently we've done some work where we've transformed existing public artworks into things that are functional and have a use and are valued, which is, most recently we did it with the Liam Gillick in Korea. I'm looking at time. I'm probably not going to dwell too much on historical context. Perhaps mention John Ruskin, who moved to the Lake District. Are people familiar at all with Ruskin? Generally, art historians are. And Switzerland is. Actually, as an aside, Ruskin recommended 10 books that everyone should read, which were things like the Bible and the Book of Common Prayer. But one of them was Ulrich the Peasant. Does that ring a bell to you? It's an account of a Swiss farmer from the 16th century. It's supposed to be first-hand, but was recently discovered to have been a fake. But yes, it's an extraordinary anomaly, but harks back to this idea of the sort of heroic peasant. Anyway, Ruskin moved to Lake District, bought the Brantwood, which is the house just below our base, and had a major influence on, translated the arts and crafts movement into a practical, functional art and craft way of life locally. One of the projects that was most kind of inspirational in a way was the road, which he initiated while he was at Oxford, and he took 60 undergraduates, middle class to upper class Oxford graduates who'd never done any physical work in their lives, and got them to build a road. He wanted them to do a useful project that would connect South Hinckley with North Hinckley. It was also a drain to help with the cholera epidemic. And the road, so 60 undergraduates, it became a kind of, they were lampooned in the press, it was a radical move. Ruskin wanted to not only build a road that was useful, but a road that was beautiful and educational. So all of the kind of writing around it is about a finite, really tiny detail. I think here, this is about liverworts, which are kind of things that most people are not that interested in, very small plants. Yeah, and but the road was they built half the road, got halfway across the marsh, and then everybody went on holiday. Ruskin went to Venice, and the road was never finished. So it is half a road which acts as a dog walking facility now for the village of South Hinckley. But from the road came an absolute plethora of projects and people who were radically altered by it, and then influenced how the arts and crafts movement, the whole sort of social agenda for Britain. They became all the sort of prime movers in that. So its impact, for me, it's always interesting that a project actually didn't work. Actually, was so influential on another level. So I'm going to onto this last. Obviously, is Ruskin's big, epic, very slim volume, which changed many lives, and is what many people key back to as this sort of vital text of the Victorian period. So it's about an alternative economy. It's an anti-capitalist tract, in effect. And yeah, I'm not going to cover this. I'm going to move through it fairly quickly. So these are various important figures in British culture. This is Gordon Russell. This is Bernard Leach. These are people who took many of the ideas of Unto This Last into the 20th century. Tolstoy. Sorry, that was Frank Lloyd Wright and his Cosmic Receptor. Tolstoy and Gandhi, perhaps most significantly importantly. Gandhi's notion of an education system for India, which was based on craft, agriculture, weaving and spinning as the three crafts from which all other education was drawn. That's why you always see pictures of Gandhi spinning. And I'm also not going to dwell on these either. This is Dartington Hall, which is a very interesting experiment in the 1920s based on Ruskin's ideas, which brought together a medieval estate that was restored and a lot of Bauhaus architects and a huge range of arts. It was American funded, Whitney money, in fact. American heiress and a British farmer getting together. So I'm going to talk a bit about the Mechanics Institute, which is a movement that started in the 20s and is something we're now very involved with. The Mechanics Institute was set up basically as adult education for a wider community. So people who are already working to further their education. And the idea of the Mechanics Institutes was that it was a very broad range of education. This is the certificate you got. It was kind of for the working man, but the working man that wanted to improve themselves. So this kind of, again, kind of slightly heroic figure, but was set up and funded by industry, by manufacturing industry largely. And this is the Mechanics Institute in our local village. So even very tiny villages have Mechanics Institutes. Most of them, there are only 12 actual Mechanics Institutes left in Britain. It was a worldwide movement, was it? Are you familiar with it in the States? Mechanics? No. No, I think it was more Europe wide. So yeah, this is our version. But most of the Mechanics Institutes are now art galleries, libraries. So things like, the Whitechapel wasn't a Mechanics Institute, but it was more or less on the same principles of, and Toynbee Hall next to it obviously was very much part of that ethos, but the Victorian translation. So this is our Mechanics Institute in the village. So this one was built by Ruskin when he moved to the Lake District. He was made president of the Mechanics Institute and immediately set about fundraising for a new institute. And the idea of it was it had a museum, and Ruskin was very keen on the ideas of museums as educational facilities. So he wouldn't allow artists to sign anything. So they were although they were full of art, they were all it was all anonymous. It wasn't art. As far as Ruskin was concerned, at this period in his life, authorship was problematic in terms of education. So he removed authorship from his museum. This is the museum opening. And you can see one of Ruskin's lecture diagrams in the background of that shot. So it's a kind of Wunderkammer idea, crammed full of extraordinary, strange things. And it, over the years and after Ruskin's death, it just built up more and more crazy stuff. But perhaps most interestingly, the museum and the institute also established 3 schools of craft schools. One was wood carving, which continued, all of the schools actually continued up into the Second World War. But the idea of them, although they were within the arts and crafts movement, they were about things that people could make for themselves, that were part of their lives, that provided an income. They were a part-time economy, so it was kind of hobby art activity in a way. It was lace making, and all 3 of the industries employed around sort of 100, 150 people at their height. So they had quite an impact, and you find all of this material still in the Lake District everywhere. It's not really valued by arts and crafts collectors because it wasn't really aiming in the same way that the arts and crafts was at the high end. It was really aiming at the everyday, and it's something that we very much keyed into, that the everyday is the thing that we most want to affect with our program and our projects. We don't want to be dealing with the extraordinary. We're bored of the extraordinary. So this was the metalworking, and this was the metalworking actually was the most developed, became the Keswick School of Industrial Arts, which was an education based on metalworking, starting with earning an income from metalworking in order to support your own education. And this was rather an obscure one, which was a cheese school, a peripatetic cheese school, which set up in various places. So these were all economic projects, and to art, when you look at them now, they look like art projects. They were. I mean, like the road, they were Ruskin's ambitions with them were to have this range of outputs. So I'm going to quickly run through Lawson Park, the base where we work. That's a glamour photo for some PR thing. That's basically the team. So we have a very small group of, in effect, administrators and managers that run the program, and then we have a collective, I would say, of people who, this is going to sound a bit weird, but have been inducted into the program. So it's not quite as totalitarian as it sounds. It's quite a gentle process where we have maybe 60 people, I would say, roughly, mostly artists who work with us on occasion in different ways on different projects. So it's an ever-changing kind of commune in a way. People don't necessarily spend a lot of time at the farm. But the idea of the farm was a derelict. It was completely derelict when we took it on, and it was one of those projects where the idea was we'd given away the sculpture park. So although I ran the sculpture park initially, I managed to offload it onto the government agency in exchange for this derelict farm, which is kind of a shit deal on both sides in many ways. But anyway. But what I wanted to do was take a functional building and make it work again. And it actually, I did kind of know that this farm had never worked. So it wasn't actually taking a building that had worked. It was taking a building that had never worked and making it work and making the land work. And everybody, of course, rightly said, "You'll never be able to do it. It's impossible," and so on. But the point of doing it was about building trust in the local community, because we could do something that was within artists able to do something. That's actually kind of almost a revelation for a wider public. Artists that have a capacity to make things work, actually. So anyway, that was the thinking behind it. So we redeveloped the farm, rebuilt it. We have a policy. It isn't designed. the idea of it's really conceptual in terms of how it's put together. So it's based on 5 aesthetics which are drawn from the locality. So they're things like bed and breakfast style, which bed and breakfast like hotels, National Trust, which is of a sort of super tasteful historic look, hairdresser modernism, which is a kind of weird version of modernism that goes on in high streets, but basically these different aesthetics that farm aesthetic, the farmer's aesthetic, which is largely never use pink or purple in anything, and pretend you don't care. So we had all these different aesthetic, and then the collections and everything in the building is part of the collections built on those 5 aesthetics, and subheadings within those on different subjects like authenticity and when modernism goes bad is one of them, and so on. But it's quite important that it isn't designed, that it's an organically growing project, and everything in the building has some kind of complicated story that relates everything to everything else. It's a history of design in a way, in the broadest sense. I won't go into the details. Quite a lot of commissions. One of the rules we have is that there is no art in the building. So nothing can be, there's no standalone art. Everything has to be functional and have some way that it's being used. So in fact, there are lots of commissions and there are lots of artworks in the building, but they're all relatively invisible. Like that, for example. I mean, it is a chair. It's actually remarkably comfortable. It's Wright felt sort of turned into a local bobbin turning, which is a technique. So lots of things like that. And then the gardens, again, conceptual, based on collections, based on plant histories of plants, and very much a point of access for a wider audience. So actually the garden works as the first point of access to the building, and then the collections in the building, and from the building onto the artworks. So everybody's garden is conceptual, and that's all. For English people, gardening is a very important thing, and nobody is that conscious of what their garden means or what they're saying with their garden. So it's a really simple conversation which we have regularly. This is the main production area. So this is one of 9 paddy fields that were actually put in place by the Japanese farmers that we worked with previously, and took an area of completely unusable land and developed it so that it became fertile. It took about 5 years to get anything really to grow, but now it is the main food production site, and largely supplies all of our program and projects, but also increasingly is starting to suggest and demonstrate to local farmers alternatives to sheep farming and what is largely kind of decorative farming that goes on locally. So farmers are encouraged to consider themselves as the curators of the landscape. That's a new idea for farmers, which is what's happening here. And they largely curate with sheep, which is, yeah. So anyway, we've done lots of trials on different kinds of viable products, and we produce quite a wide range of kind of slightly eccentric products from the farm. At the moment we have 3 Korean curators, always difficult to say, staying with us, who are developing a whole range of kimchi from our vegetable source, as well as doing some other things. This is a building which is sort of self-build, very cheap, sustainable local timber, all sawn from the wood that it's in. Actually, this looks like nothing, but in the Lake District, this was like a major issue. This was 5 years in planning to get this through. So it's actually become, for us, it's fairly conventional. The main thing that's kind of interesting about it is it costs so little to build, and we use it as an income stream. So it generates significant income, because it's completely unique. A contemporary piece of design in the Lake District is almost the only one. So that's just part of, again, it's not exactly useful, but it is quite useful to us in terms of how we function. So I'm very interested in increasingly, as an organisation, being involved in the same economy that the people around us are involved in. So we're not able to reference through to the art world, and we're not able to draw on grants to sustain us, and we're not able to use that power to manipulate what people in the area will accept. So this is the new institute revived. It's the same institute which had become derelict, and we've restored it with volunteers. And this is an example of a project we did without funding. So we didn't want to go in there with funding. It also comes from the premise that we would that we only follow invitations. So we don't ever take something to the village and say, would you like to do this? They come to us and say, will you help us with this? So we were approached with the institute, will you help us turn this into a conference facility? And the answer to that would have been absolutely no. That's a ludicrous idea, but we go along with it, and we go to endless meetings, and we sit quietly, and we slowly allow the thing to evolve more organically. So the institute, it's been got a fantastic success. Galvanized a really big volunteer group who are then the people that fundraise for it. So they hold the money. We're just a member of the committee. There are lots of frustrations where you know something's the right thing to do, but for one reason or another, the vote will go against it. So it's all centres around food, and the first thing it was redeveloped was the kitchen. And the kitchen we do a weekly, actually twice weekly now, village lunch, which is usually drawn from local waste product. In this instance, it is we eat a lot of vermin. The last dinner I cooked down there was our flock of ducks that were killed by a mink. So we had those for lunch. They weren't that good, actually. They're quite old ducks. This was some wild geese in that particular photograph. Anyway, this is the Honest Shop, which is an unmanned shop, and the idea of it is an artist project that we worked with a group of artists on it. The idea of it was to, in a way, a portrait of the village, and that we were trying to re-establish the craft guilds that I talked about earlier, and in a different form, and we wanted to get people back into making. So the village is a massively tourist place, and it sells mostly giftware from China, and there's very little indication of what people actually do in their normal lives, what the real culture of the place is. So we started this off, and this is an early photograph, and I can see that most of that produce is actually our produce. But now, 2 years in, there's none of our produce in it. It's completely packed full of stuff, too much, actually. It's quite hard to control it. And it turns over around £40,000, £50,000 a year. So 20% of that goes back into the institute, and 80% goes to the maker. But it's provoked people to make. So this is a very lively now village full of people making stuff, both crafts and gardening and baking and all sorts of things. And yeah, there are a lot. But funnily enough, I thought the financial thing would be what would push it forward. But actually, what people always talk about, the user group from it talk about, is the fact they met people they didn't know who lived in the village. It's a village of 600 people. So it kind of indicates just how fractured that was as a community, still is as a community, with people really at odds with one another and very separate. So it's kind of acting as this, starting to act as this way of bringing people in. And the other thing we've been doing with the Institute is to demand that everything makes money. So they've all got these sort of economic imperatives. And the result of that was the Institute was earning enough money to do something. So the Institute obviously started with a political notion about how it influenced, about social welfare, about how it influenced and developed the village. That's all been forgotten because people have just focused on keeping it going, staying there, and so on. So trying to reinstill that is a really surprisingly slow process. Like, this place is meant to do something. and what is it that you want it to do? So we're always trying to push that notion in all the projects, but the Institute's quite a strong one to do it because it's got great historical precedent that you can refer back to all the time. And it's slowly starting to happen. So yeah, this is the reading room. So all of this is completely from derelict. So everything had been removed. Luckily, a lot of things hadn't actually been thrown away. But the Institute underwent this slightly tragic transformation when they got government funding to redevelop the museum. So they took what was this extraordinary museum, unmanned, open museum, and they put it into a purpose-built block and turned it from an educational institution into a tourist attractor. So they just have the highlights and they charge, and it's crap. So one of the other things we're trying to do is reconnect the museum to the Institute as this wider educational facility. This is the County Council Library. So these are all kind of practical, normal projects that are part of ordinary life. It is slightly disappointing that Ruskin's 10 books are not in the library, but there's a lot of Maeve Binchy, so it's all pulp novels, very flat. This actually was designed by Liam Gilligas, but that's neither here nor there in terms of the village. It helped us get the money to do it, and it actually did help, weirdly, with keeping the funding from the county council for the library. So in Britain they're cutting libraries everywhere. This is the village hall, which is an early state. One of the ways of trying to bring this back into use was we commissioned Ray Davis, who used to be in the Kinks, or still is in the Kinks maybe, to write the school play. So it was one way of fill the hall. It was a terrible play. Oops, hope Ray doesn't watch this. And I'll just run through a few more. So there's millions of projects. This is our main focus of what we do. Every day we're working on small scale, very small scale projects in a very ordinary context that promote and provoke actually self-determination, which is probably change, but not necessarily. So this is a cheese school with Fernando Garcia Dori. But actually did make cheese that was really good. And we now have 3 cheesemakers. So small steps. This is the art fair and farmers market, which happens every year. So you have a mix of kind of some Jonathan Misa stuff on the wall. So we have Listen Gallery and various other galleries like that take stalls at the farmers market, in effect. So you have turnips and Jeremy Deller videos next to each other. 25 grand, 25p. Garden show, which was embarrassingly, the garden show was won by a miserable display of wild fruit and vegetables from Lawson Park, not the stuff that everybody works really hard to cultivate, but just wild. Usually there's a judging system for these things, but we changed it so that it's public vote. And public vote, God, the public love the notion of wild. That's another big subject we could go into. I was very embarrassed, and many other projects. Children. This is a restaurant run by children and older people. An 8-year-old filleting a place, practicing restaurants, and then projects with artists. This is Law Provost and Giles Round. Various products the village do, youth club, a lot of youth club projects, catering. This is catering for a music festival. It's a mixture of spam sushi and eel and pies, and so sort of weird kind of collection of things that the kids liked. So then the final bit of this, which I've got a minute to do it in, is our local program, and then we translate the local program into what I kind of regard as a propaganda program, which is about kind of promoting the idea of the artist as useful and functional, a newish vision, or what Bill was talking about as well. a current vision for the artist. So we get a lot of invitations. This was an invitation from Frieze Projects, was part of the Frieze Art Fair, and yeah, it's a really complicated project called the Colosseum that Consumed, and it was a ring of shops which were all either art projects or village projects, and then a performance space in the middle. So that's the Honest Shop. This is the youth club making favela style temperance drinks. So the youth club ran a anti-alcohol campaign and developed some non-alcoholic drinks, which they infused with a soda stream, slightly politically worryingly. This is one of the artist projects performances. This is an autopsy on a curator by an artist. Curator made out of gingerbread, and gingerbread was made in the village. It's an ordeal. This is ginger curator's dinner with all ginger food and all ginger curators. Anybody here? Which is obviously, these are all obviously relatively satirical projects about the art world. This is one of the groups that are involved in that, in the structure, which are Chinese group, Yang Jiang group, doing one of their things. This is a therapy hut in Finland, which we don't really have time to talk about. And this is a crafts park in Korea. I'll just very quickly show you this project, which is a kind of traditional project we did for political reasons, really, to do with funding with the Tate, and it was based around Kurt Schwitters, and it was with the artist Law Provost, and it was made with the village, so the involvement of the youth club in building a film set, which became this, and then lots of different makers in the village provided a lot of the material in that, and then Law made a film, and that became an installation. This is actually the village version of the installation. Anyway, and it won the Turner Prize last year. Was it last year? Yeah. Which is kind of, yeah, it's kind of nice that a community project won the Turner Prize. But yeah, it's not really so relevant. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there, if that's okay.
Thank you.
On time.
Thank you.